Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Bitcoin Deep Dive. I'm Conrad, the community manager at Bitcoin Well, and we're super excited to host our upcoming deep dive episode. This is a special one. And if those of you that are new to this webinar show, the Bitcoin Deep Dive is our monthly webinar where we dive deep into all the things happening with Bitcoin and kind of, we're gonna sit here and talk about something important about Bitcoin. And what we're chatting about today is something that everyone into Bitcoin has been talking about. And it's a pretty important issue because it's an unresolved issue. We're still thinking about how to move forward with this. I'm, of course, talking about Bitcoin Core and Bitcoin Knots, and as well as Bitcoin BIP 110. We're going to introduce Forrest, Bitcoin Not Crypto, as well as Zach, our content manager at Bitcoin Well. Hey, guys, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right, so Forrest, we're super excited to have you. You've got this amazing YouTube channel. If you guys haven't checked it out, I recommend it. It's called Bitcoin Not Crypto. And Forrest breaks down not only why Bitcoin is the best cryptocurrency that was ever invented and kind of it's reclaiming that name, but also helps everyone watching to understand Bitcoin better. And that's what we're going to be doing a little bit of here today. So Forrest, tell everyone who you are and how you're doing.
Yeah, that's exactly who I am. I'm a Bitcoin educator. I make content on YouTube mostly and share technical stuff, how to use Bitcoin, how to, with a strong emphasis on self-custody and some of the more technical things as well as, current events and Bitcoin price. Everyone loves talking about price, so that's always fun too. But yeah, today I came on here to talk a little bit about what's going on with Bitcoin Core, Bitcoin Knots, and BIP 110, as you mentioned, which kind of to lay a little bit of the foundation and a little bit of the history of what's going on and what's led to BIP 110, which is Bitcoin Improvement Proposal 110. Bitcoin Core is what's referred to as the reference implementation, which means it's the most widely used version of Bitcoin. And Bitcoin ultimately is software that you run. So it's an application that you run on your computer. And what that application does is it connects out to other Bitcoin nodes, other computers running Bitcoin, downloads and verifies the history of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin blockchain, and allows you to connect your wallet to it, so you can send Bitcoin and your Bitcoin transaction will be relayed through that node network. So Bitcoin Core, the reference implementation, I think it had around, I don't know exactly, 95+% of all of the nodes were Bitcoin Core until sort of more recently. There's a couple other reference implementations that have different configuration ability in the sort of more flexible area of Bitcoin, and as well as other implementations that are coded in different languages, but they're very small percentage. There was an update to Bitcoin Core that changed a specific data field within Bitcoin called data carrier size, or better referred to as op return. And this is sort of a place where you can put a little bit of data, and you can maybe put like human readable text or something that translates into something else if you input it into other kinds of software. All images can be transferred into code, basically, that can be transformed into that image. So somebody could create NFTs in the op return. There's sort of reasons why maybe that isn't as popular, and it's because that data field is more expensive to use than other ways. But essentially what Bitcoin Core did was that the op return space, by default, when you downloaded the implementation, by default it was 43 bytes of op return, and then it moved up to 84, I believe. It's either 83 or 84, just off the top of my memory here. So that's a really, really small amount of data. That's like a sentence worth of data. And that's just by default. You could change that. And this is, again, the flexible area of Bitcoin. So this is something called policy compared to consensus. So consensus is something that if you changed any of the code in the consensus side of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin implementation, it's a completely different network. It's if you change it and try to do a transaction that is with the new code that you put in, it would be it would be invalid to the rest of the network. So the 83 byte default, thank you, Michael, in the chat there, 83 is the number. That is just a sort of a default, but you could have larger op returns and they're still consensus valid. So you could relay them some other way. You could relay them with a more liberal sort of implementation like Libre Relay. You could relay them directly to a miner that could mine it into a block with a really large op return. So Bitcoin Core, their proposition was, okay, the next update, we're going to change the op return limit, and we're actually going to basically get rid of it. So now it could be an entire block could be mined with an op return. Now it would be really, really expensive to do that. You would have to outcompete the entire, all the other transactions that are trying to get into that block. But essentially, there's no cap on putting data into the op return by default. So their reasoning for that was essentially, if somebody wants to do an op return larger than 83, they're going to go directly to miners, and then that benefits these miners and creates a discrepancy between what people are expected to mine and what actually gets mined, and then that gives an advantage to the miners, and it creates a potential scenario where mining becomes more centralized because of that. So that was their argument for doing that, and hopefully I'm not straw manning it at all or being too inaccurate with that, but that's again just kind of going off memory. So then what happened was there was backlash from a certain cohort of Bitcoiners who said there's a reason the default is 83. This is non-financial, like this is purposefully, the op return is not really financial transactions. We want Bitcoin to be money. By changing the op return, you're sort of allowing Bitcoin to be used, or you're incentivizing Bitcoin to be used, or you're making the signal that Bitcoin could be used in ways that are not financially aligned with everybody else that wants to just use it as money. Mm-hmm. The initial reaction by Bitcoiners was to run a different implementation of Bitcoin, which is Bitcoin knots. And this by default had 42 bytes actually. And then since they've actually moved it up to 83, I'm not 100% sure why they changed that with one of their newer updates. But along with that are a lot more configuration in general with Bitcoin knots. So Bitcoin knots is essentially Bitcoin Core, because they want the reference to be, they want it to be as close to the reference as possible so that there isn't any issues with the consensus code, right? They're not building it from the ground up, which could create sort of incompatibility issues. It is Bitcoin Core with added code and added what they would consider patches to filter out certain information out of the mempool, right? So the mempool is what can be affected by the policy layer, the blockchain, not so much. So I'm going to bring up a tab here and show you what the difference looks like between a Bitcoin knots node and a Bitcoin Core node. Well, a highly connected node that just shows everything basically. So this is my node that I'm running. I have an Umbrel just right over there, and it's running Bitcoin knots, and I have it configured to default. So that's 83 bytes. That's not showing me transactions that are under 1 sat per vbyte waiting in the mempool. And the mempool is the green half-filled block there. So you can see there's not much going on. There's 2,000 transactions in my mempool, in my block. If I was a Bitcoin miner and I happened to mine a block and this was my mempool, the block I would mine would look exactly like my mempool when I mined that block. The blocks on the right is the same as every other node. If I have something different, I mean, there's the potential for like one block to be different and there to be 2 chains and there'd be an orphan block, but that's sort of more nuanced than we need to get into maybe. Basically, my blockchain is going to look exactly the same as any other nodes. And this is all because we're all validating and making sure that everything here is in sync. My mempool, not so much. And an example of that is looking at the website. You guys can use this as well. This is mempool.space. So I'm going to share this tab. And this is a public node, a public block explorer that you can look up transactions and mining information, all sorts of interesting stuff. And you can see that their mempool looks significantly different. So in their first block, they have 4,967 transactions. So I think mine was like 2,000.
Forrest,
yeah, go ahead, Conrad.
Other transactions, are those like non-monetary transactions? Like, are those like, does that mean there's 2,000 NFTs in that block?
No. So the main thing that I'm filtering out is under 1 sat per VByte transactions. So you can see there those other blocks. I'm actually just going to show you. So if we open this block up, you can see all these blocks here that are really small. They're paying 12 sats per VByte. My Bitcoin Knots node doesn't see those. And the way it technically works is I actually see those transactions. I say they're valid, but I'm going to filter them out. So I download them, then delete them. And then when they're mined into a block, I have to re-download them is the way it works. So some of these, you can actually put these goggles on. You guys can see this. Yeah. Okay. If you go like op return, so some of these have op returns in them. A lot of these under 1 sat per VByte do. These ones do as well. So like all of these transactions, I probably won't see unless the op return is smaller than 83 bytes, which is what's default on my Knots node. And there's other things like if you do an inscription, I wouldn't see these inscriptions either. So there's a filter to filter out inscriptions. So ultimately, you still have to download them. Like it still ends up going into the blockchain. It's just my mempool is different and selectively filters those out. And it's especially critical if I was a mining node, because if I was to mine a block without those inscriptions, they then have to get pushed back to another block. And it's less likely, right? For that instance, that 10-minute time frame, they didn't get mined in when they thought they were going to. And then it's kind of like if there's enough people supporting the idea of these filters working, it's just going to make it harder and harder for inscriptions to get in because they keep getting not selected to be mined into the blocks. So it's a deterrent and it's a filter, right? And filters are never 100% able to stop something. Like, your Brita filter, if you look on your Brita filter, it'll say 99.9% of heavy metals, right? Still 0.1% gets through. So if there's enough filtration, you can do a really good job, but you're still not changing the consensus rules. You're still not stopping this thing. You're just hindering it. And therefore, like, everything follows incentives. So if you're hindering something from getting into a block, which is what they want to happen, you're making it harder for them. They're probably it's going to be less likely that they're going to want to do it because they're going to have to pay more fees to do so. And it just becomes, there's more friction to add these certain kinds of transactions into a block if there was enough filtration going on in the mempool layer. Now, Core will make the argument that we want mempools to be very similar so that we don't have to re-download all the information that a miner mined in, so that we can get the blockchain up to sync right away, so that we can have the competitive, or sorry, an even battlefield where we all have the same blockchain and we all mine on that blockchain right away, so that there isn't a miner that has all the or a miner that has a very well connected node, mines a block and has sort of a head start on mining beyond that, because you have, yeah, exactly. And there's, sort of the argument of, like, there's other problems with mining centralization beyond this, I would say, that are sort of more paramount. And I do kind of subscribe to that personally. I don't think that making everybody's mempool the same is really that necessary for Bitcoin to function. But, that's my personal opinion, which, I'll share my opinion throughout this every once in a while, but that's where I stand on that. Yeah. So,
and my thought too about the history of it a little bit is like, I remember in 2017, it was a lot more panic. Well, similar level of panic really when the SegWit protocol was going on and people were trying to fundamentally change things about Bitcoin. and that ended up splitting off into Bitcoin Cash. And we did get SegWit. We didn't get SegWit 2x, but I know at that time there was semi-related issues with like a lot of spam in the blockchain, and it became insanely expensive to try to send on-chain transactions. And I feel like the level people are talking about it as if that's happening now, but I use the chain constantly, you know, all the time, and I'm not having any issues with expensive blocks right now. I'm not seeing a lot of issues with like spam or things being hard to send. And I understand the fear that that might happen, but I feel like we're not seeing that. And until that happens, my fear level is not at that point yet. So I'm wondering what is the reason, do you think? And, you know, am I wrong? Are people justified to feel that way? And what's the reason that people are feeling that way?
Yeah, I think so. There's a couple different things, right? Like, so I'm gonna like kind of have the counterpoints of like the knots and the BIP 110 here to kind of say what their argument is. Part of it is sort of the fee environment, but it's not really the main point because a lot of Bitcoin transactions happen on layer 2 now, right? And I think even since the Blocksize wars, there's a lot more batching transactions out from exchanges, which is, you know, consolidated the amount of space that it takes, and obviously Lightning is massive for just sort of payment as payment channels and routing system. So it's kind of a little bit less about fees, I think. The Knots crowd's argument, I think it's more about initial block time download. So that would be one of them, and then also what the content is, and what within the Bitcoin transactions that are not financial. So the op return space is contiguous, which means that you can sort of put a huge layer of, or you can put a large amount of data in one chunk. So the other ways of getting data into Bitcoin transactions is sort of hacking it in, right? It's not sort of an intentional place. The op return is almost like, here's your little garbage pile, put your garbage in there, right? It's like sort of an intentional container for that. Whereas things like bearer pub keys and things like that would be more of like a clever hack of getting something in and then combining these together and transforming that into an image, right? That data lives on the blockchain, and if you use this tool, you can see this image that's stored on the blockchain, kind of thing. Whereas with op return, you could have that all in one space. So there's a lot of arguments, and it sort of becomes a little bit confusing, but one of the arguments is if we allow people to do stuff that's sort of more of like a complicit, like we've allowed this to happen here. And then there's the argument of like, if somebody puts something illegal in there, which is maybe a little bit less of a talking point than it previously was because it hasn't happened. Like there's lots of core 30 nodes with the default policy changed, and there hasn't been any like illicit data uploaded in there as far as I know.
Isn't there technically already some of that data on the blockchain from like a long time ago?
Yes, but it's chunked in there, it's hacked in there. So because
you'd have to piece it together later. Yeah,
exactly. And it's also sort of like the argument of like, well, yes, that's there, but it wasn't like we allowed them to do that. They just found a way of doing that, and it's chunked, it's broken up. So we sort of have like a plausible deniability. Whereas if we allow a container playground, and again, I'm just arguing their point here, but we allow that space and that happens again, then it sort of exists in this really easy way of maybe like copying, pasting, or just like translating an address into it. And then it's there, right? And we've sort of more allowed it than in previous attempts of hacking information into transactions. Yeah, so does that answer your question there, Zach? Or actually there was one other thing too. So okay, so like the arguments against, so yeah, transaction fees are one. And I will say like the argument of transaction fees is also sort of financial transactions and sort of transactions that could be valued higher than their Bitcoin worth are potentially two different markets. So there would be willingness to spend more on fees than the analogy that I'll try to use here to explain what I'm trying to explain is a car is used to travel from one place to another. So somebody that just wants that utility buys a real economical car, really cheap, really good on fuel. But there's a market for muscle cars or for classic cars. And it's an entirely different market. And it's really not about driving from one place to another. I mean, that's what can happen with that car, but it's really just sort of has this premium on it. So it's almost like two different marketplaces, even though those are both cars. So that's kind of the idea there is potentially if Bitcoin gets used for a JPEG marketplace, people are willing to pay more for those transactions because there's monetary value on it that is beyond just the Bitcoin itself, because some sucker is willing to pay for this JPEG on Bitcoin, right? It's kind of, those things are always like I don't know, I consider them like scams and stuff, but people are willing to participate in those markets. So I guess the argument is there like a lot of people will say, well, fees will just naturally push out spam. But that's not necessarily true if also there ends up being sort of a thriving market for spam, because then the market, it's whatever market is willing to pay more for their utility. So it's sort of to be seen a little bit.
Would you say the thriving market for spam or for ordinals, NFTs, is dead? Like that, it doesn't seem like there necessarily is that much. And I guess to follow that up, like, let's say you had a crystal ball, Forrest, and you're able to ask the crystal ball just one specific question, and it was like, will there ever be JPEGs added onto the NFT, onto the blockchain in 2027 and beyond? And the answer was no. Like, do you think this kind of a change for the protocol would still be, or like for like the nodes? Do you think such a change would still be necessary, or do you think that there would not be a need to have such a change?
So like you're asking about the change of the BIP 110, right?
The BIP 110, and just even like is whether a move to knots will be necessary in a world where there's no more NFTs. Like everyone just collectively decide for whatever reason, reasons aside. But I think these altcoin movements tend to come in waves. We had ICOs, then NFTs, then DeFi. It's like they'll probably throw something else at us and try and trick people into buying stuff. But in a world where those aren't NFTs any longer, do you think that knots?
Like, is there another danger, another fear beyond that? Yeah.
I don't think so. Not that I understand, right? Like this is, people have kind of deemed this like the spam wars, right? Like this is the main contention, is that there's things we don't all want to store on our node that are getting into transactions. And as you guys said, like, Zach, you said you use the Bitcoin blockchain all the time. It doesn't seem to affect me as fees. I did show that mempool.space, there's a lot of transactions with op returns. Now, is it slowing down the initial block download a lot? I don't know. Like, there's sort of all these things that it's a little bit unsure about. But if the market didn't exist for these things, then there wouldn't be a need to make any change, right? Like I think that only reason to do the change is because you think spam is a problem and you think that this is a solution to the problem, which is kind of where we're going now in like the history of where we're at. So like I've explained core kind of pushing the first domino with core 30, the op return change, knots being a reaction to that. Basically, a lot of people just said like filtering doesn't work, but I would be open to a soft fork. And so again, it's really easy it's intentionally really easy to move and change things on the policy level that doesn't break Bitcoin, so that you can adjust with. And in my eyes, I actually think filtering is the best way to deal with spam. Filtering and Bitcoin being used is the best way, in my opinion. But there's a cohort that says we can adjust these things within Bitcoin's code at the consensus layer through a soft fork, which means that it's backwards compatible. It keeps the same blockchain and everything. And those changes are some of them are similar to like what the filters did. So, but it's at the consensus layer. So it stops certain amounts of data in certain data fields. And actually, Zach, would you mind just bringing up that? Yeah, there we go. So this is a post that I found, which shows 7 different ways that BIP 110 proposes to change Bitcoin at the consensus layer. And in red here is sort of the layman's readable version of this. And if you look at these are all kind of to do with stopping data being added into Bitcoin in specific ways, either through Taproot or through the witness. And a lot of people are arguing, well, these are sort of problems that already existed, and Core didn't step up and fix them how they should have when they were being exploited in some way. Yeah, and it's just up to everybody to make an opinion on this. But there's some interesting ramifications and interesting kind of things that could potentially happen because this soft fork is being proposed and being signaled by other nodes. So that's another thing you can do with a node, is you can signal within there for or against something, which is currently there's node implementations for Bitcoin knots to signal for BIP 110. So if you mined a block, within there would be the information that you signaled for that. And for this soft fork to be implemented ahead of activation, the activation time, there would need to be 55% of blocks within a 2-week period, or a difficulty adjustment, signaling for BIP 110. Otherwise, it will automatically activate, which we could talk about as well in August. There's a certain block height that it has where it'll automatically activate. And then people running BIP 110 software will essentially start rejecting blocks that have op return in them. And you can, or certain aspects, any of these, right? Any of these 7 things. If any of these get in here into a block, they will reject them. And then the Bitcoin blockchains will be different at that point, because
that's a big question that I have, because everyone's saying soft fork, but at that point it sounds like it creates a separate chain, which could create a hard fork if people are still running the old version as well and mining that. So does that create a conflict with the miners? And is there a possibility of a hard fork like we had with Bitcoin Cash back in 2017, or is I'm not sure.
Yeah, so just definitionally, a soft fork or a hard fork can create a chain split. And what we saw with Bitcoin Cash, Bitcoin SV in 2017 was a hard fork, meaning that they changed something that was no longer backwards compatible. So they widened the rule set. That's what is considered a hard fork. This is a soft fork because it restricts the rule set. It doesn't allow you to do more on here. It actually restricts it. So everything's backwards compatible still, but there's still the opportunity for a chain split. And when there's a chain split, so if everybody in 2017 agreed on making bigger blocks, even though it was a hard fork, there wouldn't have been a chain split, because everybody would have just moved to Bitcoin Cash. But because there was a split and a divide with miners and nodes and basically all the economic reality of Bitcoin, it created 2 entirely different coins. So there's always the opportunity for that. Not always, but there's the opportunity with that in this case as well, even though it's a soft fork. So there could be potentially 2 chains if people don't move over to BIP 110 and run that as the longest chain, right? It's the longest, most economical chain that ends up being Bitcoin.
And that was the fear in 2017, because it almost didn't matter which chain actually was Bitcoin. It just, whatever gets labeled Bitcoin by the exchanges at the end of the day is what people would call Bitcoin. And then you'd have 2 people claiming, no, we have the real Bitcoin, with 2 separate chains with now different transactions. And we could both, and that was the thing you could do then. If you had coins at the time, you could actually move your Bitcoin Cash out. It was a convoluted process, but you would have both coins sitting in the same address, and you could move them out onto you move your Bitcoin Cash coins out of that address and sell them separate from your Bitcoin. It was an
airdrop. It was essentially an airdrop,
like an airdrop, basically. Because you literally split whoever held Bitcoin at the time now had Bitcoin Cash as well. And it seems like we're heading towards something similar could happen, where you have now 2 separate chains and 2 separate coins that are both valid depending on which one you're interacting with at the time.
Yes, you're right. So that could definitely happen. And then if that was to happen, so say, okay, so let's paint a scenario here. Say BIP 110 gets 10% of the hash rate, right? It doesn't get 55% of miner hash rate, it gets 10%, and it activates in August. Then there's going to be this chain that starts rejecting blocks. Eventually it will desync from the current Bitcoin, I don't know what to call these two different chains, but it's BIP 110 and Bitcoin Core, I guess we'll call it. They start to look different. And then because there's only 10% of hash rate on there, it's going to take a very long time because the difficulty adjustment won't adjust until the next difficulty adjustment for the 2016 blocks. So all of a sudden, there's this really slow chain and it's rejecting all these blocks, and then it mines a block in an hour instead of 10 minutes or whatever, right? Because it only has a certain amount of hash rate. But for it to become like an airdrop situation, or for it to become like a real chain split, there would have to be enough economic interest, enough people still wanting it, that there ends up being a value of this other Bitcoin, a marketplace to be able to sell a different ticker, and all of that. So the other thing that could happen is there's zero hash rate that goes on to BIP 110, and it activates, and then it just doesn't do anything, and it gets ignored. Like a lot of soft forks have been ignored, and then that's how they just kind of fade away. So there's sort of a lot of scenarios here, but I think the ignoring it and it being so economically unimportant that it just sort of dissipates and there's no reason to list anything, that's a possibility. There's a possibility where it gets something and it becomes its own thing and it chain splits. And then there's the potential of it getting enough support that it becomes the longest economic chain. And then there's actually sort of an incentive for miners, because if all of a sudden there is a lot of interest in BIP 110, if they mine a block that is not BIP 110 compatible, and there is sort of these competing chains, there's sort of an incentive for them to move over to the BIP 110, because they'll be valid. The block they mine will be valid on both chains, and they don't risk orphaning a block on this other competing chain that BIP 110 doesn't recognize. So soft forks sort of have an advantage in that, but it is incredibly risky, and it needs a lot of support to still become the dominant chain.
In the last block wars, it seemed like the miners that left the larger chain and kind of went on the back Bitcoin Cash route kind of ended up losing. I mean, like Bitmain didn't seem like they came out ahead in 2018-19. So do you think that miners are maybe looking at that and proceeding with caution? Because it seemed like miners have tighter margins today than they did like 8 years ago. They have less influence and power like relative to one another, it seems like. So it seems like they're more risk adverse than ever. Would that make them want to take a leap on something like signaling BIP 110?
Yeah. So as far as like, I actually wasn't there with SegWit, but I've sort of looked into it a lot, and what it looked like to me was miners were actually like generally really against the change, but the users really wanted SegWit, and the miners wanted bigger blocks because it meant bigger fees. It meant more fees, right? And that's more revenue. Then there was sort of a compensation. So there was one BIP for SegWit, but then they introduced a new one sort of closer to the activation date, and then miners signaled for that. So it was sort of like this way of being able to bridge and give kind of both parties what they wanted, and so nobody looked like they kind of lost, right? And it happened really last minute that SegWit became a thing, and it was very uncertain all the way to the wire, which is probably likely, and I'm being predictive here, but it's probably likely that that's what's going to happen now, because if you, again, there is this advantage, this interesting advantage of mining BIP 110 compliant blocks and still being added to the to both chains. And if it is really sort of tight raced, but there's also, you don't want to be a miner mining on a small 10% of hash rate chain where there's no economic value, and then it sort of dissipates over time, like Bitcoin Cash and Bitcoin SV, right? Those are failed forks of Bitcoin. So there is sort of like this really thing that has to happen right at the end almost, where miners will move in whatever they actually think is going to happen. It'll sort of happen right at the last minute. They'll either move to it or not based on their prediction of will this become the longest economic chain or not. And yeah, so it's really hard to know, because I think, as far as what I read, I've read a lot of books about it and looked into it a lot, but it seemed like it was maybe less contentious about SegWit with the sort of Bitcoin crowd. Like, it was sort of like, we all want this. This is a good idea. I think it's pretty contentious with this soft fork. Everybody agrees that there is spam on Bitcoin, and that but the degree of the problem of it is kind of where we all disagree, right? Like, oh, it's not affecting me. I can still send a transaction for 1 sat, so there's not that much spam. You're not trying to download the Bitcoin blockchain with an old computer with bad internet in a third world country.
Yeah.
I mean, how, like, do we? Yeah. So there's the argument of like, oh, is computing going to increase faster than the blockchain, and the blocks are full of stuff, but it's not all monetary, so it is taking more to download it. It sort of all becomes a little bit nuanced, a little bit of gray area, and that's where sort of like every individual can have their opinion, but because it doesn't feel so cut and dry, maybe. And because of that nuance, it's hard to gauge what kind of actual support this has, and if that advantage of mining on the BIP 110 and Bitcoin Core blocks both being compliant because it's a soft fork, is that advantage worth the risk of potentially mining a block on a chain that or adding a block to a chain that is smaller than the other one, right? If the split happens and you're running BIP 110 and you mine the first block, it's going to be the first block on both chains because you're BIP 110 compliant. But then if the next block is rejected from BIP 110 and you're still mining BIP 110, you're now mining to a different chain. So that's where it starts to,
because of the backwards compatibility of the other side.
Exactly.
Of Core, right? Yeah. Or is it the other?
Yeah.
These work.
Because Core can support BIP, the BIP side, but BIP cannot won't support the other side. Yeah.
Exactly. You got it.
And first, so then how will fees work? Because I recall in the example where you showed your node and your mempool and a mempool you pulled up from mempool.space. It maybe it was about the timing, but to me it looked like there was a difference in their fees. And is that the case for miners? Like with like a BIP 110 world result, like if they choose that, would that give them less fees than if they were mining that same block with Core? Yeah.
So my mempool, maybe I can actually just bring those up again, but that's sort of just an estimation of what fees you're expected to pay to be included in that block. But the reality is only seen in the block that you actually mine into the blockchain. That's when you get the rewards for that. So let's take a look here. So yeah, 2 sats per vbyte. It says 2 sats per vbyte here as well, because that's what people are paying on average. This is sort of like a median fee, right?
Mm-hmm.
That will get you included in the block. And then if we go over to, and I don't know exactly 100% how this is calculated, but you can see this on mempool.space. This is showing 1 sat per vbyte. So it might be an average. That's kind of my guess. Is it's this fee span.
Because individual miners will have their own mempool with whatever transactions they want, and it depends who gets to mine that block, what actually ends up on the final block, right?
Exactly. So all of this is predictive, right? And that's why that was another argument for Core 30, is that you have better fee estimation, but fee estimation is really not good anyway, because kind of what you need to do for good fee estimation is you just look back at the last 10 blocks and you say, okay, well, there's times here where I can pay next to nothing, right? 0.11 Satoshis per vbyte. Yeah, the next block I might not get in if I try to pay that little, because this block here paid 1 sat per vbyte minimum, right? So it's sort of an estimation based on what the current transacting market is for fee estimation. But I think, Conrad, maybe your question was more of like fees, like if a miner mines a block on the BIP 110 chain, like is there going to be fees there? And that's where it sort of like begins to, like, this would actually be kind of a fracture in the community. So this is where it kind of becomes a little bit risky to send transactions and get your transactions mined during an activation period of a Bitcoin soft fork or hard fork for that matter. Because the one that you're picking might get reversed if all of a sudden the longest chain switches, right? If there's 50-50 hash rate to each chain, you might mine a non-BIP 110 compliant, or you might send your transaction on on Bitcoin Core with a large op return for some reason, and it's not going to get into, or maybe it's just a taproot transaction, and the way your wallet makes it's got a time, there's these kind of things where potentially you could send a transaction that wouldn't be BIP 110 compliant, even if it was a slightly normal transaction, I'll just say. Most people would be fine either way. But then you run the risk of, if all of a sudden the longest chain becomes the BIP 110 one, your transaction will actually be reversed. Like it won't exist anymore because now the longest chain doesn't have a record of that because it excluded that block entirely. So it can get a little bit crazy.
It is confusing. I mean, that's why I'm kind of still in the middle myself. Like I don't, I understand the fears. Like I don't want non-monetary data on there, but am I gonna like raise hell about it? Like, no, there's gonna be graffiti in public spaces sometimes. Like, I just don't see that there's enough sustained interest in it, like CryptoKitties or something, that it's gonna last. And there's always been non-monetary data. That's like from the very first block, Satoshi put non-monetary data in there, and although I guess it didn't take up any extra space, but yeah, maybe we should jump into questions. We don't have a ton of questions, but maybe we can touch in there, and then if anything else comes up. Did you have anything else you wanted to say for us before we move on to?
I'll just say that I kind of agree with you there, where I don't know if this is the right time to make this argument. If there was more sustained, a real, I think some of the threats, I think it's sort of like a slippery slope, and I do kind of agree with like the original Knots camp about like why change the op return limit. Like that seems to be inviting more activity that is non-monetary. And I would say that we should not invite more, like we should not slippery slope down there. We should keep Bitcoin how it is. I think it's possible that we need to make tighter rule set on the consensus layer. I don't know if the timing is right for it. I don't know if this is the right move for these specific things, because I don't know if there's really that much demand in these spaces anymore, and on all sorts of things. So yeah, to me it's a little bit iffy. I was kind of on the fence. I kind of thought BIP 110 would go through because there is that advantage that I mentioned for the miners, but I'm kind of thinking I'm not so sure anymore. I actually think that there might be a persistent chain split, which is also a split in the community, which isn't good in my eyes. Like in some ways, it's kind of like it could be clarifying in a way for the market and for the Bitcoin as a whole. But I also think that there's a lot of great Bitcoiners on both sides. I'll just say that, and I don't think that's necessarily good. Yeah.
And I think if there comes another point where there is that kind of blatant attack and spam on the chain, like in 2017, it was like, sorry, I hear my kid crying in the background. It was literally like hundreds of sats per byte for like transactions. It was insane for a while, and it was scary. You were like, what's going on? Someone was like intentionally spamming the chain just to try to screw it up, and so Bitcoin survived that. We would sustain that, and if we did come across something like that again, we could definitely react to it. but I do feel like they're trying. It's too much trying to anticipate what could happen, what maybe, and just causing dissension in that way. So that's. But again, I support all implementations too. It's like I don't want to say knots isn't wrong either. It's like I want more than just core, as the implementation for sure. Like I don't want things centralized into one entity either. So
100%. I would just say there is moments like if you're watching your initial block download, it's really fast at first, and there is moments of time where it slows down like crazy because there is a lot of like there's like an inscription boom or like a runes boom or whatever, and it is a lot more for your processor to handle and your hard drive to take. So that's a big part of the argument too that I do agree with. But again, I just don't know if this is the right way to go about that, or if it is just potentially diminishing as well.
All right, Conrad, do you have another question before we jump into questions?
Gosh, I'm wondering if this is the best play for Bitcoin. You talk about dividing the camp, and I think this is a time where the community really needs to get stronger. And I'm worried that this is not the right time to be fracturing the community. There's a lot of we were expecting, I think, in the last couple of years, a lot of momentum with Bitcoin treasuries kind of spreading from companies to countries, and we kind of saw that kind of get interrupted a little bit. And I think I don't think we need to take our frustration out on price and kind of trying to fracture ourselves. I think we kind of maybe if we could kick this down the road just a little bit. I don't see ordinals popping up in the feed, and they probably won't until the price returns way up, because we've seen time and time again is that when the price rises dramatically, or when anyone encounters a significant wealth effect, they're going to change the things that they buy. It's like when you're struggling on money, you buy ramen noodles. When you get a huge raise at work, you don't buy ramen noodles anymore. You buy fancy things, and maybe when you get a pay cut, you don't stop leasing that fancy car or whatever it is. So I think that's probably why we're not seeing as much activity. And maybe if we see return to activity, I think the conversation we would be worth resuming, because this could just be a one-off cycle.
Yep. Yeah. Either way, it's going to be interesting to watch come August, and I think people should be aware of it happening, because it is happening. There's an activation of it. There will be some support, and there was actually a question there that I thought was pretty good. Why I thought the chain split would be prolonged, considering 3.125 Bitcoin or 3.25 Bitcoin per 10 minutes is on the line. There's potentially miners that are ideologically driven. So if there's and Bitcoiners that are ideologically driven, right? They're very against what Core did, and many other things that Core has done. And I think that's potentially why there could be a prolonged chain split, is that there's some hash rate, but maybe it's not. But it's not enough to become the dominant network of Bitcoin again.
What would you define as prolonged, if you don't mind me asking?
I mean, it could go for the entire duration, right? This is a temporary soft fork as well, so it has an activation date, and then it has a date where it ends, which I don't exactly understand how that works either. I mean, I have knowledge gaps in all of this too. I've done a lot of research, but if it goes back to the way it was, that's actually opening up the data set, opening up the rules. So I don't know how that works. We go back to where we were, but I imagine its temporary nature was designed in a way so that they would either decide that it's not temporary or decide on a permanent fix. Yeah. But by prolonged, I don't really have an estimation of any specific amount of time, but maybe the whole entire activation of it, and then all of a sudden Bitcoin just rebases to the longest chain again. I don't exactly know how that would play out though.
Okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to add on to what Conrad was saying. I think the biggest fear for me is just the split in the community, really, because I see, especially as Bitcoin becomes a bigger player globally, that's like the #1 tool of governments to break things up, is to cause division, to latch on to genuine concerns and then escalate them to insane degrees to cause division and splits in communities. That's like the CIA's #1 tool to do things to communities. So, you know, just no matter which side you're on, and you may be 100% right, you know, but just be aware that there's people out there that are genuinely trying to do the right thing, and they may disagree with you. It doesn't mean that we're all evil. It doesn't mean that we're Roger Ver from back in the day from the Blocksize wars. You know, there are sometimes evil people out there doing things like that, but most Bitcoiners are just trying to figure it out and do the right thing. And we all believe in freedom, you know. So you want to jump into some of the questions before? I know you got a hard cutoff, so we got like maybe 5 minutes to mad dash some questions real quick.
Sure, I'll take a look at the ones you starred here.
Yeah, so can you see the starred list?
I can.
Here,
yeah.
I'm going to add them in real quick.
Sure.
So question, with the direction Bitcoin Core is going, is there the possibility that someone inserts CSAM into the blockchain? If so, has consideration been made into how this will affect the narrative around the Bitcoin community? Is this a potential soft target to damage its reputation? We kind of touched on that a little.
Yeah, and I would just add that Bitcoin is always under attack, right? And you know, if that happened, of course there'd be tons of news headlines, and price would react, and maybe some Bitcoiners would shut off their nodes, and there would be all sorts of collateral from that. Yeah, so
I think that's already happened too. Like we were saying, I think there already is some material like that on there. It's not as easily readable, but the data is in there. If I don't know how you do it exactly, but you use programs to piece it back together. That is
and you're right about that. Yeah, but I think the argument is that, again, it's the contiguous data, and then it's everybody has that sort of in one piece on their home server, and that could call into question legality and all sorts of things. But I think again, that hasn't happened, so maybe it's just a little bit overblown, which is kind of interesting because BSV, which is a failed soft fork or failed hard fork of Bitcoin, changed the op return, and immediately there was CSAM on the blockchain, like almost immediately. And this is just, I've read news headlines or news articles about this, so I don't know exactly how it happened, but supposedly all they could do was just ban the person from some wallets that they use to do it, and nobody runs those nodes anyway, so there's not really any consequence to it, I guess. But you know, it'd be much different with Bitcoin, right? Because there's thousands of people running those nodes.
Next question from B-Well, any relation to Bitcoin Well? Any thoughts on the production-ready initiative by Samson and Jimmy to develop a conservative implementation? I'm assuming of BIP 110. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, it's not of BIP 110. It's just another implementation of Bitcoin. So it's a conservative implementation, which I don't exactly know what that means. I think they do have a website somewhere that shows kind of what their ideas are with that. But it is, again, just a clone of Bitcoin Core with changes to the code at probably the policy level, right? Because if they can't change anything else there. So, and I, again, agree with you, Zach, where we need decentralization with implementations, right? Like Definitely. That was my initial thing. As soon as Knots came out, I was like, I don't know where to land on this, because everything was so new and like just trying to figure it out. But like, what's the problem with having more than one implementation? Like if this could potentially be there's sort of like three governing arms of Bitcoin, right? There's the miners, the nodes, and the developers. Yeah. And by having different implementations, you have different pockets of developers. And yeah, they're sort of all working off the reference, or the vast majority of them are. And that's just because Bitcoin would be so hard to code from base in a compatible way from a different language or in a different way. But it's possible. People are doing that. It's just different developers that can implement different things and decide on stuff, and the reference implementation can change, right? Because more people would run one other one that they prefer for whatever reason.
Yeah, the more the better to me, for sure.
Yeah.
Let's see, next one, also from B-Well. What are the trade-offs of dealing with the spam problem at layer 2 instead of forcing a controversial soft fork on the base chain?
You can't deal with so it's spam on the layer 1, which you can't deal with on layer 2. Like there's the possibilities of being able to, well, Liquid's a side chain. It's not really a layer 2, but there you can like tokenize things on Liquid, which is a peg in system and sort of a federated or not federated model. Yeah, federated model of like it's kind of like proof of authority is how it's been described, kind of. And again, that's not Bitcoin, but people could tokenize things on there. There's like MetaPlanet stock tokenized on there and stuff like that. And that could be seen as spam in some way, right? Or like you could do other things on there, but that's not Bitcoin. So any layer 2, you can, and actually you can tokenize, like there's, you can use USDT on Lightning, right?
Yeah.
So that could be a way of doing that. But again, that's not really a solution to the problem because it's layer 1 spam that is the contentious issue. Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe you can incentivize those people to go to a second layer, but yeah. It's up to them what they want to do.
It's up to the market to have that incentive too. And, you know, there's kind of this incentive from spammers to say like, we'll get spam in where you don't want it because that makes it more valuable because it was harder to do. So there's kind of a weird thing like that. Like if you like spam on one of the thousands of crypto coins isn't worth as much as spam on Bitcoin because Bitcoin is the dominant cryptocurrency.
So like trying to tag something in a cool spot and get
exactly.
Yeah. But this wasn't exactly a question, but BIP 110 opens the door for censorship, and there's no way governments around the world won't jump on that and screw Bitcoin up. Is there any fear about BIP 110 being used for censorship for actual monetary data?
There's a couple little things where there's potentially monetary transactions, but there's also this grace period of 2 weeks as soon as it gets activated and becomes like the largest chain where you can move those transactions still. And that's so that if you have financial transactions or anything that is not compliant with the new changes, that you can still move those and get your Bitcoin. And it's not like a freezing or confiscation type problem. Bitcoin is a set of rules that we all voluntarily agree to by participating in the network and by using it. So I don't think tightening the rules necessarily and having broad consensus of all of the majority of Bitcoiners is censorship. I don't think that's the way censorship works because we've all agreed on those new sets of rules. It's not a hands down thing. It's like the dictator here is the Bitcoin network, and we're agreeing on which implementation of the software we want to run. If we don't want to run that, then we're making a choice not to, or running something else. So I don't see that as censorship, but that's my personal interpretation of that.
And it is after 8. It's 8:02. Do you have a few more minutes for questions?
Yeah, maybe just like 3 more minutes. Yeah, I do have to run here pretty quick.
All right, lightning round. We got 5 questions. How about the government arresting you for CSAM on review? We kind of talked about that already. Let's do another question. I was trading JPEGs as an artist. Where was his question? I'll skip to the end. How much time and tech is involved in hosting a node, just in general? How hard is it to host a node?
Oh, it's really easy. I mean, you can do it on the computer that you're using right now to watch this. You could download Bitcoin Core or Bitcoin Knots by going to their website and pressing install, and it runs software on your computer. Now it's hard drive intensive. It's going to be about 830 gigabytes of hardware of hard drive that it needs to take up. So it's better to do it on a dedicated device, in my opinion, like an Umbrel or a Start9 or a home server, and then connect to it through your local network and run an Electrum server on there. There's sort of the Bitcoin node is really simple and kind of dumb in a lot of ways, and sort of intentional to make it really secure. And then apps are built on top of it that reference your node. So the mempool that I showed of my node is an app that just looks at the raw information in my node. Electrum is kind of a server that indexes and can look up addresses really fast. And that is really compatible with a lot of wallet companion apps like Sparrow and Nunchuck and Cove. And you kind of really want that if you're running a node, in my opinion. And it's harder to do on just your computer, like the first example I gave you. So going the route of using Umbrel or Start9, they're designed to run Bitcoin nodes with applications built on top of them that are accessible by any computer on the same home network. It's really easy in that way. It's very plug and play, click install, copy and paste a couple things, boom, you're good to go.
Yeah, if you're curious, Julia, just do it. It's really easy. Just make sure you have a big hard drive and try it, download it, play with it, see how it works. It's awesome.
Yeah.
All right. Gene says, Joel, are you on dial-up internet connection?
I think that was the chat roast.
I think he was referring to you had some pixelation going on there for a minute. Sorry, I put that in there as a joke. I shouldn't have done it. All right. Question 2. Spam is over half of the on-chain transactions currently. Do you think fees increasing, people using Bitcoin as money, helps alleviate that?
Yeah, I mean, it creates more of a fee environment, but it isn't guaranteed that fees are going to increase, that there will be more monetary transactions. We've gotten pretty good at using Bitcoin and not the base layer. Again, back to Lightning. Now there's Arc, which helps with liquidity and Spark, which helps with, it speaks Lightning and makes it even easier to use Lightning, basically. And Liquid is another thing. And batch transactions. We've become very efficient at not using Bitcoin, but using Bitcoin.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily true that we're going to have more transaction fees.
Not hearing you. Sorry.
I was thinking, it seems like if anything, overall demand for block space would go down.
Maybe.
So like that would lower the cost overall, it seems like, rather than increase the fees in a situation where there were no more ordinals. So
yeah, which I mean, we don't want to just have a Bitcoin blockchain that is just ordinals to pay fees to miners, right? Just to keep it alive, keep the fee environment alive. Like, we do want a use case that is financial, even if it is just opening and closing Lightning channels for large, payment for organizations that want to make a lot of payments together and close those kind of accounts out, open them up and stuff. That's a use case, but we would need a lot of adoption for that to become the dominant fee generator. And it's really hard to predict, but I think there will be more use cases for Bitcoin, the Bitcoin blockchain, that are not considered spam transactions into the future, because it's going to be the base layer of money. Like, if you want final settlement, you want to use on-chain. You don't want to use Lightning. You don't want to run into liquidity problems or routing problems. You want to use on-chain. So there's a serious use case there, but it just requires more people to care about Bitcoin and to have Bitcoin.
Good point. All right, last question real quick. This is a great final question. Where do you all stand personally on this? Will you be signaling for 110?
I was signaling for 110, and I've kind of been flipping and flopping a little bit I've been on the fence for a long time. I have active communication with like the biggest proponent of BIP 110. So when I talk to him, it's like, oh man, this is so obvious. Like, we got to be doing this. But then I step back and kind of think, I don't know. So I'm currently not signaling for it, but I'll be paying close attention to it and figuring out what is the right. I think it's all going to come down to the wire, and then I'll kind of I have a nice cop out where I'll just say I'll decide then more.
Conrad, what about you?
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of on the fence still. I don't see necessarily, to me, it seems like the default position is core, and not seems to be a move to kind of change things and improve things. And I don't necessarily see a massive financial concern, which seems to have been like the primary driver, even thinking of like cost to upgrade nodes, cost to improve a bandwidth connection. So I don't necessarily see an alarming economic need to make this change at the moment.
Yeah, that's where I am. I'm not signaling, but I'm also not running the newest version of Core. Like, I don't want to be at the bleeding edge, because Bitcoin is very backwards compatible in that way. You don't have to run the brand new version. I don't really support either side in that way. Like I don't necessarily trust Core, and I don't necessarily want to put my faith in that either, but I support your decision to do that too. So I'm not against 110. I'm just not necessarily going to do it myself right now. And like Forrest, I'm just going to wait and see a little bit as well.
Yeah.
Well, cool.
Yeah, and that's a good way to do it for anybody wondering is to run an older version, maybe not too old, like you need security patches and things. Again, in Umbrel, it's really easy to change your version of Bitcoin Knots and of Bitcoin Core. And there's versions of Bitcoin Knots that don't signal for BIP 110 as well. So yeah, I think in general with software, it's probably a good idea not to rush to update because there can occasionally be bugs and then they have to retroactively fix those and you could be exposed to that bug. And it's especially important with something where you might have all your wealth in, like Bitcoin.
Yeah,
definitely.
It's not just another iOS update, you know, there's consequences here.
Exactly.
Well, thank you so much, Forrest. This was an awesome conversation. I've learned a lot.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. This was fun.
Yeah, thank you.
It was a pleasure. It's like I got a slide here with the tag too.
You want to wrap us up real quick, Forrest? If you need to run, you can. We're just going to close real quick. If you can, try to leave your computer running because it will like upload your video from your side up from a technical level. But if you have to shut it down, that's okay too.
Gotcha. No problem. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and thank you, Forrest, for coming on. Folks, if you guys want to follow Forrest on Twitter, we got his tag there included below, as well as Bitcoin Well. You can follow us there on Twitter as well. We post about upcoming webinars, everything that's happening in the Bitcoin space, plus all the cool things we're building and developing here at Bitcoin Well, spreading Bitcoin, helping distribute Bitcoin to self-custody. And thank you very much for joining this webinar. For everyone who's here, please stay tuned, and you'll hear from us for more webinars that we got coming up in this month and in the months ahead.
Yeah, thank you everyone for coming, and I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. There was a lot there at the end and a lot of comments I didn't get to look through, but thank you guys so much for coming and talking with us. It's a great experience. Bye, everybody.